Welcome to the wonderful world, the wonderful, diverse, amazing, stunning, absolutely beautiful world of Islamic art. Now, this lecture has to be just a basic introduction, and what we're going to focus on is sort of the origin and formation of what we call Islamic art. And then we're going to look at the essential traits of what makes Islamic art different. You're going to see that actually some people prefer not to use the term Islamic art just because of the huge diversity, the enormous span of the globe and also time that we look at. Of course, Islamic art from Spain is going to look quite different from Islamic art from India or Islamic art from Africa because there are so many local traditions that flow into it. But there are 7 essential sort of traits, basically, that do make Islamic art, or what we call Islamic art, a little different from art from other periods and cultures that we have looked at. And of course, calling Islamic art a culture is also a misnomer. One of the readings that I have assigned to you will actually go into that a little bit more deeply. But you are in for a treat because the works of art in this lecture are of incredible beauty and also diversity. And they're going to be unlike anything you have seen so far. The word Islam simply means submission to God. And Islam, just like Judaism and Christianity, is a monotheistic religion. Muslims actually worship and honor the same God as Christians and Jewish people. And the creed of Islam is there is no God except God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. So Muhammad, or Mohammed as he is also known, is simply seen as the last prophet in a line that began with Moses. So Moses, Abraham, and a series of other prophets, including Jesus, are seen as the messengers of God, and Muhammad is seen as the last in this line. So, what a lot of people don't realize is that Jesus is seen as the last prophet before Muhammad and is actually highly honored in Islam. Another important pillar of Islam is that you are meant to pray 5 times a day if you can. Ideally, you will go to a mosque if you can, but if not, you can actually pray wherever you are. During the holy month of Ramadan, you practice ritual fasting from sunrise to sundown. This is meant to remind you of humility. Charitable giving or almsgiving is a very, very important part of Islam. So, generosity towards the poor. And you'll see that a lot of mosques include soup kitchens, for example, or hospitals that help the poor. And then once in your lifetime, if you are able bodied, you are meant to go on the Hajj. This is a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the 5 pillars of Islam, one of your readings will tell you a little bit more about Islam in general and these 5 pillars. Since this is unfortunately not a religious studies class, we can't dwell on this too long. But that reading will tell you a little bit more about Islam in general. It will also tell you a bit more about the Hajj and the holy city of Mecca and the Kaaba, which is the destination of the Hajj. We touched on this briefly with some other art terms as well. Islamic art is a modern concept, and we need to remember this doesn't refer exclusively to religious art, and of course, there's an enormous regional and chronological variety. And the people who were making these works of art, they weren't thinking of it as Islamic art, of course. And there are actually some modern scholars who don't really like this term. I think it's too artificial, it's too broad, and there's such a wide variety of different times and places that I think that, Islamic art is just too broad. And one of your readings actually goes into more detail on why this modern artificial term that we've created is maybe a bit too broad. But using the term does have some useful applications, because even within this huge diversity of Islamic art, there are a few essentials that do set it apart from other types of art. So do your reading that talks about why the term Islamic art is a little bit problematic. But if you go to your next slide, we will look at the essentials of Islamic art. And don't let the next slide intimidate you. It will be a wall of text, but it's essentially the table of contents for our lecture. So let's forge ahead and look at the essentials of Islamic art, keeping in mind that the term is an artificial construct. All right, so this is basically our table of contents for this lecture, but it's also basically a checklist of what makes Islamic art different from, say, the European art we've been looking at so far. These are the essentials of Islamic art. And the first thing we're going to be looking at is the origins of Islamic art. So point number one is that Islamic art is descended from and heavily influenced by multiple visual traditions. So we can trace basically its origins, and it develops from the art and architecture of Rome, the Byzantines, and the ancient Persians. So it's basically a fusion of those three cultures. And we're going to be looking at a number of examples for that. Now, the buildings of worship for Muslim is known as a mosque or a masjid. And this is our second point we're going to be looking at. And a mosque is a monumentalization of various house forms. So it descends from house forms, so domestic buildings, and its design and organization reflects the practical and essentially egalitarian essence of Islam. All believers are thought to be equal before God, and the architecture expresses this. This is a really important point of Islam, and we're going to be coming back to this. Everybody is thought to be equal before God. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. There's actually no priest class in Islam. And the architecture really emphasizes this. So we're going to come back to this, and I'm going to explain this to you in a bit more detail. So that's point number two. Now, number three is a really important point, and this is something that people often misunderstand. Islamic art isn't interested in naturalism. We've seen this in other cultures as well. Remember when we looked at early medieval art and Byzantine art, late antique art? Artists really weren't interested in naturalistic art, right? The same is true for Islamic art. So they're not interested in naturalism. They're not really trying to replicate nature. Instead, what artists want to do is they want to portray the meaning and essence of things rather than just their physical form. So they're really interested in capturing, say, the personality of something rather than what it looks like. So this means that abstraction is a key value of Islamic art. And this is something that people often misunderstand. They believe that images of living things are forbidden. But this isn't actually true. So this does not mean that Islamic art is always aniconic or that images of living things are forbidden. So aniconic means lack of figures of living things. As we're going to see in Islamic art, in a religious context, you're usually not going to find images of people or animals. But in a private context, anything goes. So that's point number 3. And if you feel we're going a little fast, don't worry. We're going to revisit every single one of these points again. This is just our table of contents. Now, number 4 is an interesting one. You'll remember that up until this point, we've been seeing a lot of sculpture and painting, right? This is because in Western art, sculpture and painting are considered the noblest forms of art, right? They're really popular, they're really highly praised. You'll remember that the early medieval art of the Anglo-Saxons is an exception. You'll remember that they really liked portable jewelry, textile, then little bit later, books. Well, Islamic art is the same. They really highly praise what, in a Western context, might actually be called crafts and decorative arts. So you'll see that things like pen boxes or metal dishes or textiles, rugs especially, are seen as high art. So, for example, a beautiful carpet, a beautiful inlaid plate, something like that, is considered as a high work of art rather than just a craft. And then 5, 6, and 7 actually are quite highly related. Writing has high status in Islam, and calligraphy is a major art form. So calligraphy is beautiful writing. This is something that Islamic art actually shares with Chinese art, Japanese art, and a couple of other cultures, that beautiful writing is an extremely significant form of art. It's used not just in books, but you'll see it's used to decorate buildings, for example, as well. So calligraphy is an extremely important form of art. In fact, in some places, calligraphy is the most highly regarded form of art. And then we saw this actually in the early Middle Ages. Books, manuscript illumination, and decoration are major art forms. So books are extremely highly valued. And then you're going to see that geometry and patterns are extremely complex, highly developed, and sophisticated forms of art. So you're going to see these incredible geometric decorations being used over and over again. And I have a wonderful video posted for you that actually shows you how these patterns are created. So this went a little quick for you. Don't worry, we're going to return to each one of these points again. This is basically our table of contents. All right, let's start and look at the history of what the world looked like before the rise of Islam. So Muhammad started becoming really active around 612 CE. So let's look at what the area that would eventually become the sort of Muslim super kingdoms. Let's have a look at that area before he became active. So the two superpowers in this area were the Byzantine empires, which you were familiar with. You can see it here marked out in orange in a map on the left. And then you'll remember we looked at the early medieval kingdoms. They had become fairly stable. You would have had sort of the empire that would eventually become Charlemagne's empire. And then you had the kingdom of the Visigoths, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about. And then the other superpower we unfortunately also didn't have a chance to talk about. You can see it on a map on the right in greenish yellow, is the Persian Empire. This is sort of the new Persian Empire. You'll remember that Alexander the Great had also conquered a Persian Empire. So the religion of the Byzantine Empire, you'll remember, was Christianity. The Persians followed another faith, which was Zoroastrianism, which was also monotheistic. This faith actually still exists today in some parts of India and Persia, and there is actually a Zoroastrian community here in Austin too. So this is what the world looked like before Mohammed became active, and he lived in the Arabian Peninsula. So the Arabian Peninsula had been part, at least part of it, had been part of the Roman Empire. So people had been polytheistic, there had been a Jewish population, there had been a Christian population, and a big part of the population of the Arabian Peninsula had been sort of nomadic or semi-nomadic. There were cities as well, and most of the people were polytheistic. Now, Mohammed caused a real phenomenon, and his new faith caught on extremely quickly. And we will go to the next map and see how quickly his new faith caught on. So let's head to the next slide. So just during Muhammad's lifetime, he actually managed to basically convert and take over with his followers the entire Arabian Peninsula. Because Islam was something of a breath of fresh air. This faith was completely different from any religion that had come before him. Because you can see that under his first three successors, a huge swath of the Byzantine Empire and a large chunk of the Persian Empire were actually conquered by the first three caliphs. So the caliphs are basically Muhammad's successors. And one reason for the success of Islam, particularly in the Byzantine Empire, was by this point, the Byzantine Empire had become very bogged down. You remember, if you look at the mosaics, how very hierarchic everything was, how very rigid everything was. The Byzantine faith was very hierarchic. It was also very top heavy in a bureaucratic manner. Byzantine Christianity in the 6th century, you had to go through a priest. You did not have direct access to God. You had to pay very heavy tithes. It was also very hierarchic in the sense that if you were wealthy, you stood in the front. You had more access to the priest. If you were poor, you had to stand in the back. So in a way, your access to God was very much regulated by your own social standing, your own hierarchy. But Islam is very different in that sense. There is no professional priestly class. Charity is very important, but you're not really required to pay a tithe in the same way that you were required to pay in Byzantine Christianity. And Islam very much emphasized the idea that your access to God is direct. You don't have an intercessor. Everything is between you and God. You don't have to go to a church or a mosque. And everyone is equal before God. It does not matter if you are rich or poor. And this was incredibly empowering. So a lot of the conversions were absolutely voluntary. So this is one reason why Islam's spread was so swift, so successful. So you can see how very, very quickly the expansion happens in these three big pushes. And you can see that it spreads very, very quickly over the entire Persian Empire. huge loss of territory to the Byzantine Empire, and Spain, this is going to become important later, Spain and a small part of southern France become Muslim as well. And the push is going to continue until it eventually reaches India and parts of Southeast Asia as well. So, this idea that everyone is equal before God is one of the reasons why Islam becomes so popular and spreads so quickly. Okay, now that we've had a bit of a history background, it is time to look at some art. So, where does Islamic art come from? So, Muhammad and his followers, so most of his followers were fairly simple desert tribes. We've talked about nomads before. Most of their art tends to be portable, and they don't tend to have an architectural tradition. And Mohammed himself, actually, he didn't have much use for architecture. He was actually a little bit disparaging of it. But his descendants, his successors, very quickly realized once they had conquered parts of the Byzantine Empire, parts of the Persian Empire, they very quickly realized the political power, the messaging capability that you get from architecture. And one of his successors, and there were a lot of competing Muslim rulers very quickly, realized that he needed architecture if he wanted to compete with these other cultures. And one of the earliest surviving examples of Islamic architecture is this building right here. It's called the Dome of the Rock, and it's standing in Jerusalem, and it was completed in 691 CE. Now, it's had plenty of renovations, it's had plenty of different new decoration added to the outside. So, the golden tile on the outside was a later addition. That glorious blue tile was a later addition. But the inside is still pretty much the way it was in 691 CE. And you'll see when we see the inside that Islamic art is descended from and heavily influenced by multiple visual traditions, especially the art and architecture of Rome, the Byzantines, and ancient Persia. And we're going to see influences of these in the Dome of the Rock, especially when we look at the inside. And this building, its interior design, its placement, its symbolism is absolutely fascinating, especially its placement. Also, do you notice the gateway in the front? The shape of the arches. Do you notice that they are pointed? Once Islamic architects become confident, they start experimenting. And it is very well possible that Gothic architects got the idea for the pointed arch from their Muslim colleagues. So let's have a look at the location of the Dome of the Rock, what it might mean, how it gets its name, and what exactly its function is, because it's a little bit mysterious what exactly its meaning is, and its symbolism is very, very rich, and its location is just chock full of history. So let's go on a little tour of the Dome of the Rock and the area around it. So here you can see that the Dome of the Rock really is on a prime piece of real estate. It's this natural rock outcropping that is at the highest point of Jerusalem. And this natural rock outcropping, it's known as Temple Mount or Mount Moriah, or it has a whole bunch of other names. And it's this incredibly holy site to three world religions. It's holy to the Jewish faith, it's holy to Christians, and it's holy to Muslims as well, because this is the site of a really important event in the Bible. This is where Abraham, a really important figure in the Old Testament and the Torah, is said to have almost sacrificed his son Isaac to God. So it was basically this ultimate test of faith. And the Dome of the Rock actually frames and protects the very spot where this event is said to have taken place. Mount Moriah, or Temple Mount, is also where the great Jewish temple once stood. So this was once the focus, the center, the heart of Jewish faith. And this great temple was then destroyed under the Romans. It was never rebuilt. And this marked the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. So it's this unbelievably holy site. And you can see in the lower left corner, there's also a very, very old mosque, one of the oldest surviving mosques that we have. So it's this unbelievably sacred site, and you can see how the Dome of the Rock, it rises above the landscape. It's unbelievably visible. It sort of dominates the skyline of the city. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So keep in mind how incredibly important this site is. And let's talk a little bit more about Temple Mount. Now, one part of Temple Mount is the so-called Western Wall, which is an incredibly sacred space for Jewish people because it's really all that remains of the great temple. You can see the Dome of the Rock just off to the left there. And this really is all that remains of this temple that had been the focus of the Jewish faith. So this is basically, it's something of a pilgrimage space for Jewish people. If you look carefully on a photograph on the right, you can see all those little writing tables. So a lot of Jewish people will come, they will write a prayer and then place it between the stones of this remaining wall. So it's a very, very important holy site. But you can also see how you can't miss the Dome of the Rock, how it really dominates the view of this holy space. The Dome of the Rock was very carefully designed. Its location was very carefully chosen. So like I tell you, it frames this natural rock outcropping. You'll see it in the next photograph. We'll actually see the interior of the Dome of the Rock. This rock is said to be where Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac. It is also said to be the departure point of Muhammad's night journey. So Mohammed is said to have had this vision in which he traveled from his home to Jerusalem and then traveled from this very spot to heaven, where he basically saw what heaven looked like while he was still alive. So this spot is doubly important to Muslims. So this is why the Dome of the Rock was designed and placed on this spot. You can see how it dominates the landscape. And now, do you see where the black arrow is pointing? There is another building. It's a very large building. Its domes are almost the exact shape as the Dome of the Rock. And originally, when it was first built, the Dome of the Rock was not yet gold. That gold plating was added later. So those two domes would have looked almost identical. That dome in the background is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is where Jesus's tomb is located. So this is the tomb where Jesus was buried and from which he then was resurrected. So it's one of the holiest sites in Christendom, if not the most holy site for Christians. And you'll notice that when this city was taken over by Muslims, that this church was not destroyed. It was preserved as a really important holy site. But notice that the Dome of the Rock echoes the design. It's as if our new religion is saying we are one step further in the chain. And that is the way that new Muslim rulers sort of saw themselves. We are the next step, we are the next development. Jesus was the last prophet before Muhammad. So we are the final step in the development. And this, in many ways, is what the Dome of the Rock is saying. It is, in some ways, a victory monument. And the caliph who built it, in some ways, built the Dome of the Rock to rival the Kaaba in Mecca because a rival Muslim ruler to him was in charge of Mecca at the time. So he wanted to build a beautiful shrine that would not just impress Christians and Jewish people and sort of attract them to the new faith of Islam, he also wanted to impress other Muslims. So Muslim rulers very quickly realized just how important architecture is. So this is the outside of the Dome of the Rock. And remember, it was simpler in the beginning. It did not yet have the golden dome. It did not yet have the beautiful blue tile. It would have looked a lot more like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the two buildings would have echoed each other much more. The comparison would have been much more invited. But let's go to the next slide. Let's have a look at the inside, and you will see just how much this building is drawing on Byzantine and Roman prototypes. And you will see to what degree early Islamic architecture is indeed a descendant of these two cultures. And we'll see a little bit later the Persian influence as well. And here we are inside the Dome of the Rock. So you have this natural rock. It's completely uncarved, unfinished, surrounded by a balustrade. And then you have two ambulatories that surround it. So the dome is above the rock itself. You can just get a glimpse of the windows to give it lots of light. And you can see those beautiful marble columns. We have gilded capitals, those beautiful stripy arches, and then those golden mosaics. Hopefully, this will remind you of some of the other structures we have seen. The columns and capitals and arches should remind you of the Romans, and then those gold back mosaics should remind you of the Byzantines. And then the domes should remind you of both the Romans and the Byzantines. But you'll notice that there's a spin on this that also makes it unique. So you can really see here the origins of Islamic architecture that is borrowing very heavily from both Roman and Byzantine prototypes. And the mosaics, these beautiful gold back mosaics, were in fact made by the best craftspeople that the patron could find. They were in fact made by Christian mosaic artists from Constantinople. So the caliph that sponsored this wanted only the best quality craftsmanship and marble, just like we have seen in many other beautiful architecture commissions that were really meant to be the best of the best. So no expense was spared here. So you can see that unusual rock that is framed by this building. So the Dome of the Rock, it isn't actually a mosque. It isn't really a prayer hall. It's more sort of a shrine. It is a victory monument. It's actually a building we don't entirely understand till this day. There's actually a room below the rock, the purpose of which we don't actually know. It's sort of a contemplative space where people can just sort of come and contemplate the importance of this, religiously really important place. It's usually open to Muslims. Sometimes people of other faiths are allowed in as well. It sort of depends on the political atmosphere of the time. So sometimes it's open to everybody, sometimes it's open to only Muslims, sometimes it's closed for security reasons. So if you're visiting Jerusalem, it really depends on the political climate of the time, whether you're allowed in or not, unfortunately. In this slide, you can see another view of the interior. So on the right, you're actually standing in the larger outer ambulatory. You're looking through the smaller inner ambulatory towards the area where the rock is. You can't quite see it here because you're a bit too far back, but you can see how everything is covered in these beautiful golden mosaics and the gorgeous Corinthian style columns. You can see how the columns are monolithic, so they're one piece of beautiful marble. You can see how they're all different kinds of marble too. So you can see how no expense was spared to make this interior an absolute gem. And then on the left, you have a cutaway view to give you a better idea of what the interior looks like. So you have the dome, then you have a clerestory under the dome with all of these arched windows, so you have lots of light. This is very Byzantine style. Remember in the Hagia Sophia, we had all of these windows under the dome. Then you have the rock itself. Notice that the rock, it's very irregularly shaped, and then you have the balustrade or railing around it to protect it. So you can't actually walk on the rock, it's protected. And then you have the two ambulatories, the inner and the outer. The ceiling of each one is covered in those gorgeous golden mosaics. So the shape of the building is actually octagonal. It's what we call centralized, right? The rock is at the center. And then you have the two ambulatories that go around it. So you can actually circle the rock if you want to. It allows more people in. And if you look very carefully on the right-hand picture, if you look very, very carefully, you can actually see some people sitting by the railing, sort of just meditating thoughtfully, which gives you a little bit of an idea of the scale of the building. One of them is wearing sort of a white cape over their head, which will give you a little bit of an idea of the scale. So let's go look at the next slide, which will show you a comparison between the design of the Dome of the Rock and a Byzantine building that you're somewhat familiar with, which will show you again the strong Byzantine influence on the design here. Here's a nice comparison between the Dome of the Rock and then the Hagia Sophia, where you can see the marble columns and also the marble veneer. Remember how the walls of the Hagia Sophia were covered in those beautiful large marble panels? The same decoration is used on the interior of the Dome of the Rock. So you can really see how the interior decoration is borrowing very, very heavily from Byzantine styles. So you can really see that here. Interestingly enough, though, the column capitals look much more Roman. They look much more Corinthian than the ones in the Hagia Sophia do. And like I said earlier, the mosaics, most of them were carried out by Byzantine craftsmen who came all the way from Constantinople because they were the best of the best, and the patron wanted the highest possible quality. Now, in a traditional Byzantine museum mosaic, you would often find animals in the sort of scrolling vines. If you look carefully, you see sort of spirals in the mosaics. Those are stylized vines, so plant vines. In a Byzantine version, you would find birds and animals and even people. Here in the Islamic version, you have only the plants, and we will talk about why you have only the plants and no people or animal. But you have that heavy influence of the Byzantine that has been changed a little bit for the Muslim patron. But let's go to the next slide and we will see something that is uniquely Islamic in the decoration here already. If you look on the right, the lower right, you can actually see the rock here in better lighting, and you can really see the shimmering and the shining of the gold mosaic. You can see a little bit of the dome, the interior of the dome here as well. This is actually a much later style. So that was actually done much later. It was redecorated. You can also see the multicolored voussoirs. Do you notice that they're striped? They're done in a green and then that gray marble. You will see those striped voussoirs quite often. Now, notice that the blue arrow, it's pointing at that band right there. And then on the left, I have another close-up. Notice what seems to be an abstract pattern of that gold on green. This is actually writing. Calligraphy, beautiful writing, is actually a really high form of art in Islam. And already in this really early building, I'll say this again, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, example of Islamic architecture that we have that survives. And it already has calligraphy as a description. And this is an inscription from the Quran, and it runs through a lot of sections of the building. It's basically a blessing, and it's read from left to right. And notice it has this beautiful sort of rhythm to it. And it's a fairly square script. We call this the Kufic script. So this is a form of decoration that we will find in buildings and on all sorts of objects. And it's a very, very important form, a very high form of Islamic art that we're going to see again and again. And already here on the Dome of the Rock, we can find it used quite extensively. This beautiful, beautiful, very stylized form of writing. So even if you're fluent in Arabic, this is actually very, very difficult to read. You can also see below it a beautiful detail of the golden mosaic, and then a more stylized style of mosaic above as well. So here you can already see a little departure from the Byzantine and the Roman. And I promise you, you will see some of the Persian influences a little bit later as well. So let's go on and have a look at the development of mosque architecture, which you will see is also heavily influenced by particularly Roman architecture.